They are afraid that President Trump is abandoning the traditional conservative devotion to free markets and instead is taking a statist or indeed socialist approach to the economy. Why is Trump engaging in these kinds of industrial policies, and how much farther does he intend to go? And a big question we Americans have to ask ourselves as we look at our policies in the 21st century is, are we going to be able to compete with China in this field? President Trump has recently given old guard conservatives cause for concern. They're looking at his industrial policy. They're looking at the fact that the United States has just acquired a 10% ownership share in the chip manufacturer Intel, and they say this is socialism. Old guard conservatives are saying anytime you have government owning the means of production, government buying part of a private company, that is socialism, or at least a step in the direction of socialism. And that's very concerning to them. They are afraid that President Trump is abandoning the traditional conservative devotion to free markets and instead is taking a statist or indeed socialist approach to the economy. Now, there is a complication here which even a lot of old guard conservatives recognize. Namely, Intel is a strategically important company. It's the United States' only manufacturer of computer chips. Without Intel, we would be totally dependent on foreign sources for the computer chips we need, not only for civilian applications, but also for military and government. So there is a strategic case to be made that the United States has a special interest in Intel, but does that necessarily mean that the United States should have an ownership interest in Intel? Well, before we get to the specifics of Intel and what President Trump is trying to do, it's worth stepping back and taking a look at what the idea of socialism amounts to in the 21st century. Now, obviously, in the 20th century, the acme of socialism, the maximum extent of socialism was communism. It was took the form of states like the Soviet Union, where all the means of production were at least notionally owned by the state. And of course, they were controlled by the party, they were controlled by the commissars. But that was the kind of economic system that conservatives were adamantly opposed to. Certainly they were opposed to it in foreign policy, they were opposed to the Soviet Union, to the spread of international communism, but also any step in the direction of socialism within the West, among our allies like the United Kingdom, or in the United States, in the case of various big government plans, various plans for government involvement in private industry that were part of the New Deal and that were part of other democratic programs. All of that was very objectionable to American conservatives throughout the Cold War. For that matter, even when Republicans, such as President Richard Nixon, undertook some of these mixtures of government and private companies, that too was seen as being very objectionable by most ideological conservatives during the Cold War. However, I should mention that, of course, conservatives during the Cold War realized that fighting the Soviet Union, being able to compete with the Soviet Union militarily, might involve some move away from a pure free market approach to our economy. So, for example, defense industry would naturally have a close relationship with government. Ideally, we wanted to have our defense industries competitive. We wanted to have multiple contractors competing for government bids. Nevertheless, conservatives during the Cold War did recognize that there was going to be a closer relationship between government and certain industries, especially aerospace and defense, than ideally free market economics would lead us to desire or to expect. John Stuart Mill, one of the leading liberal philosophers of the 19th century, famously described conservatives as the stupid party. But listeners to the Modern Age podcast and readers of Modern Age, the journal, certainly are the farthest possible thing from being stupid. They are, in fact, the intellectual aristocrats of the 21st century, and they have been of the 20th century as well. They are reading a quarterly journal in print, produced every 3 months, and which has the most thoughtful conservative articles you will find practically anywhere. They're also readers of modernAgeJournal.com, our website, which is a place where you can find thoughtful and deep conservative reflections on not only what's happening today, but also on the trajectory of Western civilization over the course of centuries. And this podcast itself is directed towards a more intelligent discussion of the issues that are happening not only in the headlines, but also the currents and trends behind the headlines that are influencing the direction of tomorrow. Now, classic socialism and classic communism in the 20th century was about national governments. Even though communism in the Soviet Union and the communist movement in general framed itself as being internationalist and globalist, in practice it never really was. And in fact, one of the great scandals for communists and for socialists was that their own ideology told them that the workers all around the world would have a common interest, an economic interest, a class interest as workers, and that therefore they could unite across borders and overthrow national governments and create a worldwide communist system. What actually happened, though, of course, is that it turned out the workers in most countries were among the most patriotic elements in the population. They did not see other working class people in other countries as necessarily having exactly the same interests as themselves. Instead, they saw culture and politics as being localized, as being something that was unique to their own nations, and that therefore they actually saw communist movements in other countries as being their enemy rather than being something that is meant to be their friend because of a supposed class interest. So the whole Marxist theory that class interest on the part of the working class was going to transcend borders was wrong, and it shocked the Marxists to discover this. It was one reason why a rather more pragmatic tyrant like Joseph Stalin decided that he was going to have socialism in one state, as he called it, the Soviet Union, and then use the resources of his state to try to promote socialist revolutions elsewhere. Why he was going to do that rather than have the expectation, as more idealistic communists did, that there would be spontaneous working class movements all around the world, just naturally bringing about a world government as the working class transcended the bounds of national borders and created a world system naturally and on its own. So the communists were wrong about that. It's interesting because since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, since the end of the Cold War in 1989, what we've actually seen has been something like the opposite of what the communists imagined. It's not the working class which transcends borders and which has a sense of solidarity with its fellow workers all around the world. It's actually the elites who seem to be transcending borders. And it's elites who are, in many cases, they're even transnationally educated. So you may have quite distinct elites in communist China and in the United States, and yet where do the elites of communist China want to go to get their higher education? Well, they go to Oxford University in the UK, or they go to American universities, in the Ivy League and elsewhere here in the United States. And of course, there is a shared interest on the part of elites all across the world in globalism. You've had a sort of convergence between even the elites of a country like communist China, which again, these are actual Communist Party elites. These are actual communists. Nevertheless, they have been very closely aligned with the economic interests, and in some cases even the political interests, of elites in the West, in the supposedly free and capitalist world. Now, that's something that no communist would have expected in the 20th century, but it's also something that should really disturb anyone who truly is an advocate of free market systems, because it seems like there's something about the globalization that took hold at the end of the 1990s and that persists to this day that in fact has been very beneficial for communist states like communist China, and that actually has brought Western elites into a more close communion with those Chinese communist elites. Now, think about what it means to have socialism in a globalized economy. So, critics of President Trump are saying that if the United States buys a 10% share of Intel, a stake in Intel, that is a move in the direction of socialism, or it is outright socialism. But if you're going to apply that standard in the United States, don't you also have to apply the same standard elsewhere in the world? And it turns out that many of our allies, including the other allies from whom we are buying computer chips, are engaged in the same kinds of operations. So TSMC, which is really the world's #1 chip manufacturer, it is the Taiwanese, so Republican China, it is the Taiwanese chip manufacturing company. Well, TSMC is a private company, except that its largest stakeholder is, in fact, the Taiwanese government. So if you're going to say that Trump buying 10% of Intel is socialism, then you also have to say that Taiwanese chip manufacturing is socialism. And obviously, of course, many of the consumer goods we need, including many of the electronics we get, these are finished computer goods rather than the chips that are the basic components of the goods. These assembled final goods are often assembled and put together and shipped to us from China. And that, of course, has been the story of globalization, the story of China's integration into the global economy over the last 30 plus years. So think about this. Our defenders of what they claim to be free markets say that this era of globalization, this era of worldwide free trade has been a great boon. They say that it is, in fact, a vindication of capitalism, of free markets, and it is, the antithesis of communism and socialism. But actually, many of the most important players in the global economy are states, whether they are friends of ours like Taiwan or rivals like China. They are states which either are, in fact, in the case of communist China, communist and officially socialist, or they are states like Taiwan or South Korea or any number of other American friends and allies that are, in fact, engaged in government partial ownership of private companies. So in other words, by the standards of Trump's critics, these countries are also socialist, and the products they produce are also socialist. Now, what does that mean for the 21st century global economy? Well, seen from one angle, the 21st century global economy, because it is based on worldwide trade, might seem like it is an example of free market capitalism. But if it turns out that the entities engaged in the trade, the companies and the governments, are in fact in bed together, if it turns out that the governments in many cases own the companies, then what you really have is not a system of true global economic freedom, but rather a network of different socialisms, of different degrees of socialism in different countries, which are then engaged with trade with one another. Now, rather than calling this a system that is purely capitalist and free market, you could in fact look at this and say, this in fact looks like a new form of socialism. It's a new form of socialism which, instead of having a single unitary global center, has in fact a series of nodes that are networked together, and that this is a network of socialism rather than being a truly free system. Now, I think that would be a consistent free market way of looking at the world system as it actually exists. And again, if you're going to claim that what President Trump is doing, what the United States is doing, is socialism, then you also have to apply that same label to even relatively free trading partners like Taiwan and South Korea, and you certainly have to apply that label to a communist state like China. But all of this obsession with labels would be misplaced. In fact, you have to take a more realistic view of the world. And even during the Cold War, realistic conservatives said that there might in fact be compromises that have to be made where we could not simply pursue a pure free market agenda. That, for example, the government would have necessarily a very close relationship with defense contractors, with the aerospace industry, and perhaps with other industries as well. Energy, for example, in the atomic era, when nuclear energy is something that can provide a tremendous domestic benefit for the country, obviously nuclear energy is also something that potentially has a connection to a nuclear weapons program and to the risks of proliferation. So there are lots of reasons why even domestic nuclear energy programs tend to be tied in with government and with military concerns, strategic concerns. So it's not the case that we, either in the 20th century or today, are looking at socialism on the one hand and pure free markets on the other. The actual economic systems that have been in conflict in these eras, the actual economic system that we have today, is a mixture. And it's important to recognize the way in which governments, the way in which states, use this mixture competitively to try to gain advantage over one another. Now, our friends who are libertarians and who are strictly devoted to the free market like to talk about the fact that free markets are not a zero-sum game. And in theory, anyone engaging in trade, voluntary trade with someone else, is in a system where both parties are profiting. It is a positive-sum game where everyone is coming out of it after engaging in an act of trade, after creating goods that they can buy and sell. Everyone is coming out of that system better off than they went into it. And nobody is losing something simply because someone else is gaining something. So economists like to think of free market economics as a positive-sum game, and in most cases, that's correct. However, in the case of governments that are fighting competitively not only for wealth, but also are trying to compete militarily, also trying to compete in terms of influence, in terms of propaganda, There is a case of something that is certainly not a positive-sum game. And in fact, when you have one system or one set of ideas or one government with its military power gaining, that's often, in fact, usually a case of someone else losing. So when you mix these two things together, as you inevitably do, because of course, in order to fight a war, in order to have even expressions of soft powers, it's called, whether that's propaganda and communications or whether it's a show of economic strength, in order for governments to compete with one another, whether it's militarily or with soft power, they have to do it using means that are produced by factories, that are produced by companies, that are in many cases produced by free market processes. So free markets wind up being enlisted by governments in this competition, which in fact is a zero-sum game between governments. We can't afford to be naive about this in the 21st century. Now, let me explain one reason why President Trump is engaged in buying shares in Intel, why he's also engaged in a similar operation with U.S. Steel. Trump has permitted a Japanese company, Nippon Steel, to buy U.S. Steel, but in doing so, he's insisted that the United States government have what's called a golden share, which will give the United States a certain amount of control over things that happen now with U.S. Steel, even under Japanese ownership. Why is Trump engaging in these kinds of industrial policies, and how much farther does he intend to go? Well, Trump has talked about using the Intel deal as a kind of model for building what is called a sovereign wealth fund. Now, traditionally, sovereign wealth funds are created by governments that get most of their revenue from natural resources, particularly oil. So governments such as those of Saudi Arabia or Norway will take their oil revenues and use those to create a fund which will invest in stocks and bonds and all kinds of other financial assets, just as any kind of private financial fund will do. The reason these governments do this is because they don't want to be dependent on a single industry for their nation's well-being and prosperity. So you can imagine that if your country is primarily an exporter of petroleum, that if the price of oil goes down, this is going to create an economic shock in your country. And you'd like to diversify your portfolio. So one way you might do that is by creating new industries in your country. But you could also simply take the revenue that you get from your oil companies, and you could invest that in stocks and bonds and foreign companies, for that matter. And then you would be able to ride out any kind of market shocks that might affect oil, because instead, even as oil goes down, your basket of investments in your sovereign wealth fund might go up and compensate for what you're losing with the oil. And in general, this is the kind of strategy that actual investors, actual capitalists pursue. So you might be a capitalist who owns a company, but you don't want to simply be dependent on the fortunes of that company. You want to take some of the returns that you get from your company, and you want to invest them in the stock market and thereby get the benefit of the returns from the stock market. So your profits and your overall wealth is not just dependent on the company that you created and might own. It's also based on what you've invested in, where your assets are. Well, governments can do the same thing. And of course, to the extent that governments do this, they are able to defray the burden that would otherwise be placed on their citizens through taxation, or that would ultimately be placed on their citizens by selling government debt. Of course, if you sell government debt, your citizens don't pay taxes immediately, but they wind up incurring debts that have to be paid off later on with interest. So traditionally, the two ways to finance a modern government are you tax your citizens and you sell debt. But a sovereign wealth fund presents a third option, where government will take its revenues, invest them directly in the stock market, or invest them directly in assets, and will then be able to prosper from earning interest rather than paying interest. And it'll be able to gain revenue from the accumulation of wealth in its assets, and occasionally selling off some of those assets in order to, on the free market, in order to make a profit. So this is a way for government to actually relieve its taxpayers of burdens they would otherwise have to carry, and instead, by investing in the free market, gain access to resources, gain access to profits that are basically coming through market processes, and therefore are not a burden on taxpayers, but instead are a relief to them. In the case of Norway, Norway has the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. It is a pension fund, and it pays for 24% of the Norwegian national budget. Now think about that. We here in America, we have these annual or even more than annual conflicts in Congress over the debt ceiling, over how we're going to finance the government, over whether we're going to have government shutdowns because the amount of money we're bringing in just isn't enough to pay for the various government services that we have. Well, think about, instead of having that crisis every year, instead of thinking about, well, okay, we're going to issue more debt now, but of course that debt is ultimately going to have to take the form of taxes when taxpayers are due for paying the interest and for paying the principal on that debt. Well, instead of doing all of that, you could instead be investing government money in the free market, in the stock market, and using the prosperity of the stock market in order to pay for government. So there's a certain logic to that in terms of being able to help your own people, place less of a burden on them. And also keep in mind, this is not simply a matter of whether or not this is something a government might want to do for itself domestically, but also increasingly governments have to think about their competition with other governments. So I mentioned that Norway has the world's #1 sovereign wealth fund, but in fact, China has the #2 and #3 sovereign wealth funds. And China, of course, is not a petroleum exporter. China is not in the same category as Norway or Saudi Arabia. China instead is interested in using sovereign wealth funds simply to gain greater economic strength. And it, of course, uses the sovereign wealth funds in two ways. Not only does the sovereign wealth fund bring in revenue, not only does it help to defray what would otherwise be the costs of government, but also sovereign wealth funds give the Chinese government leverage and access to all the companies that it invests in. And this, of course, is a national security issue. It's certainly a national security issue for America and for the West, because if you have a Chinese sovereign wealth fund buying stocks from American companies or from European companies, or for that matter, from companies anywhere in the world, including Africa, then you wind up with the Chinese government being able to have significant input on these companies, being able, in some cases, to infiltrate these companies, to put board members into them, to put employees into them, and generally to have access to their secrets and be able to craft their economic strategy. This is actually how the great the great conflict between China and the United States in the 21st century is primarily being played. It's going to be played at a financial level. There certainly is a military component. There's a lot of tension, of course, always around Taiwan. But this matter of economic power and this matter of economic influence is really the wave of the future. And of course, having U.S. programs that are just government welfare, like USAID, a worldwide government welfare program, that's nothing like the degree of influence that a country can have relative to what it can do if it has a sovereign wealth fund that it is as wealthy as China's sovereign wealth funds. So China has very much an industrial strategy, a political strategy, as well as a strategy for financing government involved in its sovereign wealth funds. And a big question we Americans have to ask ourselves as we look at our policies in the 21st century is, are we going to be able to compete with China in this field? Now, there certainly are good free market reasons for criticizing sovereign wealth funds, for criticizing President Trump's Intel deal, and for looking with a degree of skepticism at what's happening. The first problem, of course, is that government has so many resources that if it buys into private companies, it can wind up completely distorting the market. It can wind up distorting the stock market. It can wind up distorting the way an individual company like Intel works. The way President Trump's deal with Intel has been structured, supposedly the United States government will not be having a heavy hand in Intel's actual operations. It will be a very hands-off purchase. However, there is still a lingering concern among free market thinkers, and for good reason, that nevertheless this is going to create conflicts of interest. It's going to create all sorts of ways in which you may have a kind of crony capitalism or a self-dealing kind of operation take place. And that will be bad for the competitiveness and the operations of a company like Intel. Intel is already rather troubled. And the fact that we only have one chip maker in the United States, we only have Intel, is, it seems to me, quite a serious concern. That really when you want to leverage the benefits of the free market and of capitalism for national defense and for national concerns, you should have competition as one of the elements of free market strength that you're able to draw upon. So I would like to see the United States promoting more competition domestically in the chip manufacturing area. But of course, there are certain industries, and this is certainly true of steel, where it's very, very difficult to have several companies within the country all competing in the development of original steel. Right now, a lot of the steel market in the United States is actually a secondary market where it's recycled steel, and that's fine. But you actually do need the ability to create new steel as well. And really, U.S. Steel is the only company in our country right now that's capable of doing that. There are very few companies all around the world that are capable of doing this, which is one reason why it did make sense for Nippon Steel, this Japanese company, to buy U.S. Steel. This is not necessarily a loss of our sovereignty. This is not necessarily a compromise of any kind of security or economic pride on the part of America. On the contrary, Nippon Steel knows how to run a steel company very effectively, and they're going to be able to help U.S. Steel. So I'm quite pleased with that. I'm a little more worried about the Intel deal, however, because again, Intel has been something of a monopoly on making chips in the United States. It is a company that has sort of lost its innovative edge, and it seems to me that you have to restore that innovative edge, and that's probably not going to happen through government financing or through government buying a stake in the company. Instead, Intel has to have a degree of competition, ideally competition that's domestic, so that if we find out that Intel isn't doing a good job, we can then turn to another domestic manufacturer rather than being dependent on a largely government-supported, foreign chip manufacturer like TSMC in Taiwan. So that's one concern. There are also concerns that sovereign wealth funds are going to lead to a loss of independence on the part of free markets, that instead you're going to have markets that will be catering not to private investors, but they will be catering to governments instead. Now, keep in mind, while there are good reasons why libertarians and many economic conservatives are critical of this threat, that conservatives over the last 20 years have many times contemplated moves that would have the same sorts of risks as Trump's interest in creating a sovereign wealth fund have. So, for example, there was an interest on the part of conservatives during the George W. Bush years and after in creating a privatized form of Social Security. So you would still have mandatory payments into Social Security of some kind coming from American taxpayers, but a privatization or semi-privatization of Social Security would mean that instead of the government taking money from everyone and putting that money into treasury assets, which is what the Social Security Trust Fund exclusively invests in, and they have very poor returns. Instead of having that, the government could instead say, here are a number of private funds which have portfolios of stocks and other assets, and the government has approved a number of these funds as investment vehicles for taxpayers who are forced to pay into the Social Security system. In other words, the government would be letting Social Security payees decide for themselves where they would like their money to go among a pre-selected batch of funds. Now, the risk there, of course, is something called moral hazard. Moral hazard is something we experienced during the Great Recession when all of these financial institutions, banks and insurers and others, turned out to be insolvent and they needed a bailout from government. And the line of the day was that they were too big to fail. Well, that's an illustration of moral hazard. Moral hazard is when the risks of a supposedly free market enterprise are socialized. It's when you have something that, for example, is too big to fail, and therefore, when it does fail, you're going to get a government bailout. In the case of a sovereign wealth fund or a privatized Social Security, if you have enormous amounts of government-controlled funds, whether they are Social Security taxes or whether they are government money that's going to be invested, if you have massive amounts of government money going into the stock market, going into private assets, those assets then become things that the government cannot afford to see go into a sharp decline. So if there were a massive problem, a massive decline in the price of stocks, and you had people who were forced to invest in stocks, basically, or who were highly encouraged to invest in stocks that they were told were safe by the government in the form of a semi-privatized Social Security system, Naturally, taxpayers would say, wait a minute, I can't lose my entire retirement savings, all this money that I invested from my Social Security taxes into a private fund, and now that private fund is doing badly. Hey, the government's got to come and bail me out. I'm only invested in this fund because the government told me it was safe and because they told me I had to invest in some sort of Social Security vehicle. So you would see there would be a tremendous political backlash in that scenario. Likewise, with a sovereign wealth fund, if the government is invested in private companies domestically, which may seem like a smart thing to do for industrial policy rather than investing in foreign companies and stocks, if the government is highly invested in domestic companies and those domestic companies start performing badly on the stock market, the government starts losing money rather than making money on the sovereign wealth fund, that's going to cause a tremendous political backlash, which in turn will not just be a political backlash, but also an economic backlash that may have damaging repercussions for the operations of the stock market. One of America's great strengths is that we do have a very free economy. We do have a very free capital market internally. And this is something that government is obviously very eager to tap into and gain advantages from. But it's also something government, if it gets deeply involved with, could disrupt and actually, basically kill the goose that is laying the golden eggs. So what Trump is doing, on the one hand, is strategically wise, but it also carries some very great risks. It seems to me the best thing that free market conservatives and libertarians can do is not to pretend that they live in a world of pure free markets. They should not pretend that any form of government involvement in private companies is socialism. And they should also not pretend that this era of globalization and free trade that we've had over the last 30 years has been an era of pure free markets, because in fact, not only has it promoted, even among free parts of the world, a high degree of government investment in private companies, but also, of course, this globalized economy of the last 30 years has been the source of strength and prosperity for communism itself, for communist China. Instead of having this sort of perfectionist view, free market conservatives, libertarians, and others who care about capitalism should take a realistic view of the world. They should look at the competition that not only takes place on the market, but also that takes place in a more zero-sum game between governments. And they should craft a set of ideas that can then mitigate the problems that will arise if the United States government builds a sovereign wealth fund, if the United States government gets more closely involved in domestic industry. It may have to happen to some degree, but there are obviously better and worse ways to pursue an industrial policy. There are more and less free ways to pursue a combination of government strength and free market prosperity. And you don't want to have a system whereby, because all the free market economists, all the conservatives and libertarians, old guard conservatives and libertarians, have simply walked away, that therefore their voices, their criticisms, their warnings are not being heard by the people who are running government policy, who may be more conservatives who are interested in a economic nationalism or populism. So these things need to come together. And the old guard conservatives, the free market conservatives, and the libertarians actually do have important messages to give populists and economic nationalists. But the populists and economic nationalists are winning politically right now for a very good reason. Namely, they have a more up-to-date understanding of the competition between states in the world in the 21st century, of the need to maintain our national borders, and of the utopian folly of pursuing a world without borders, united by a single governing class, a kind of upper-class socialism rather than lower-class socialism. That is what economic nationalists and populists, including Donald Trump, have been warning about and are trying to prevent. And too many free market conservatives and libertarians are unaware of the way the world works in the 21st century and are instead leading us precisely into the jaws of the beast.